I can't explain it, but the butterflies seem to know where the bodies are. I've been a park ranger since I was 18. After 5 years, I really can't imagine doing anything else. I was in the Scouts when I was younger, and have been an avid hiker all my life. Time spent in the woods is time well spent, and the ability to work there every day is absolutely a dream come true for me. Being a park ranger, you see your fair amount of bodies in the woods. People come out here to hike and swim and forget that there are things here that will kill you. They run afoul of animals, they get sucked into the rapids, they don't pack enough food or water, and they just get lost and aren't found till someone chances upon them. Spring 2023 was the year that we got some help from the butterflies. It started with the death of Angel Myers, but it certainly didn't end there. Angel Myers was what you would call a minimalistic camper. She would come in with a few essentials, just kind of camp wherever she decided to drop down. She knew which plants would kill her and which ones would nourish her, which was good. She also knew which plants would get her higher than airplane wings, which was bad. We had called the cops on Angel several times, but they always cut her loose a few days later, and the rangers refused to toss her a lifetime ban from the park, and she just kept coming back. When a pair of hikers told us they had found a body in an area we knew as the Meadow, we supposed this would be the last time we had to call the cops on her. She was naked, and it wasn't the first time many of us had seen her in this state. She wasn't bad to look at, but it's always a little weird to find someone stark naked in the elements. She was splayed out, spread eagle, in the flowers that grew in the meadow, and her eyes and tongue were missing. That wasn't terribly uncommon either, not with all the varmints in the park, but the little black growths on her skin were definitely something I'd never seen before. She had 3 rows of perfect little spikes, each of them about 3 inches long, and each line about 9 spikes long. Other than the spikes, the strangest part of the whole scene was the butterflies. They weren't a species I was familiar with, and they were bone white with light black patterns on their wings. They were thick over the body, and I assumed that they had been what had drawn the hikers. They were circling in a cloud, the white easily seen against the green canopy around them, and I was as amazed by them as I was the weird protrusions on her skin. "What the hell are these?" I asked, reaching out a finger to test if they were sharp, but finding them squishy and full of green liquid instead. "Pallida morse," Rico, one of the other rangers I worked with, said. "One more time in English for the rest of us," I said. "Pale death," he said, pointing to the butterflies. "They're rare. I don't think I've seen one in the flesh. They're supposed to live in the deep woods, and they only come out every few years to lay eggs." I pointed to the little row of spikes running up her thigh. "On corpses?" Rico nodded. "That's why they call them Pallida morse. They lay eggs on corpses, though it's usually of animals. I've heard of them laying eggs on human bodies, but it's rare. I guess they found the corpse before we did." The hikers said about the same thing when we questioned them. They'd been hiking to the meadow, his fiancée wanting to see it in the spring, and as they came to the end of the trail, she had noticed the swarm of pale butterflies and wanted a closer look. She had thought they were pretty, but as she got that closer look, they'd seen the body and realized they were swarming around it. We called the station and got some guys from the coroner's office down to pick her up. We hoped she would somehow be the last body we found that spring, but I think even then, I knew it wouldn't be the last body I saw taken out of the park that year. The next one was a hiker named Marcus Dre, and his death was truly terrible. Some campers had gone fishing in the Connoisseur River, the waterway that runs through the park, and as they chased the trout that were beginning their journey to the spawning ground, one of their kids came across a grisly sight. He said it looked like a scaled claw was sticking out of the river, and he ran to his mother thinking it was a monster. She had expected to find a rock formation or maybe a stick with some moss on it. But what they found was an arm covered in the black spike pods the butterflies leave behind. "They looked like scales," the mother had said, still a little shaken by the experience, and I could understand why he thought it was a monster's hand. It wasn't until I got closer that I realized the arm was jutting up from the foam. At first, we thought the guy had just fallen into the river and gotten stuck behind the rocks after drowning. When we pulled him out, however, we got a better idea of the extent of the damage. Somehow, he had been forced into a small space between the two rocks, and they hadn't done it gently. His shoulders were broken, like snapped in the middle and just folded up. He was crumpled up like a suit coat in the hole, and that wasn't all. Something had eaten his face. Not like Angel, where the eyes and tongue were missing. They had eaten his entire face off, skinned him down to the skull, and there was nothing left but ragged flesh and scored white bone. If it hadn't been for the arm sticking up, we might have never found him until someone panning for minerals had found a skull or a finger. The butterflies, the pale death, had presided over everything as we managed to get him onto the shore. After that, we found 4 more bodies in a month. One was left on a mountainside, its hands missing and its nose and lips chewed off. He'd been climbing the low-grade mountain that we have on the grounds, and when he'd gone missing, we thought he might have been in a small avalanche due to the snowmelt. When a fisherman found him laid out on the lowest peaks, however, we knew it was something much worse. The second was a woman who'd gone into the woods to relieve herself during a picnic, and was found in the low branches of a tree. Well, half of her was. The other half was high up in the tree, and something had eaten her legs. The husband had to be hospitalized after he identified the top half of his wife, and I felt bad for the kids. They'd been here to enjoy a picnic in the park, and something had taken that away from them. The third was, unfortunately, a child named Caitlin Mills. Caitlin would have been 6 in July, but she never got the opportunity. Caitlin was the strangest, and also the easiest to identify. Caitlin had left her parents' campsite in the night, but it appeared that whatever had found her had taken an interest in her. Something had taken care of her in the woods. Something had fed her. Something had changed her clothes. Something had made sure she drank clean water, and then, unfortunately, its care had lapsed. Caitlin hadn't died because her face had been eaten off. She had died because her skull had connected with the ground and cracked. It was pretty clear that she had fallen out of a tree, but the coroner said that she would have needed to fallen from a pretty steep height. She was stretched out, too, as if something had made her comfortable as she lay dying. The fourth was the worst, and the reason for what came after. The fourth was Ranger Franklin Carpenter, and he'd gone missing after going to check one of the pump stations. We had 6 pump stations, things we used to bring clean water to the campsites, and he'd been responding to a call about a malfunction in Station 4. He had gone out before lunch, and we found what was left of him the next day, after he never came back. If he hadn't died wearing his name tag, then we wouldn't have known who it was. His arms and legs were missing, and believed to have been eaten. His face was gone, as was the top of his skull and what lay within. Something had gnawed his chest, eaten his buttocks, chewed his genitals off for good measure. It was just a torso and part of a head when we found him on the edge of the woods, and a lot of us got pretty scared after losing one of our own like that. Over all 4 bodies, the butterflies held sway, and their eggs were in evidence. I expected a visit from the head ranger, but when he arrived with a man in a black suit the next day, we should have known that something was about to happen. He had a few other men in similar attire, and Rico lifted an eyebrow as we took our seats at briefing. None of these guys were dressed for more than a slow stroll over a concrete path, but I doubted that was their intention. Agent Lee has been gracious enough to come and help us with our problem. We'll be splitting into groups so you can canvass the woods. We need to find whatever is doing this before summer starts, especially with one of our own being a recent casualty. We have a lot of ground to cover, so Rangers will be splitting up with 2 of Agent Lee's boys to show them the trails and help them bring this to a close. So that's how I found myself in the woods with Agent Feist and Agent Martin. Agent Lee might have looked like an investment banker, but these two had traded their Brooks Brothers suits for camo and assault rifles. We had broken out shotguns that we used to put off angry wildlife to supplement the firepower that the agents had brought, and the three of us proceeded through the woods. Agent Feist wasn't a big talker, but Agent Martin made up for it by asking questions about what we had seen. I told him about the bodies, the parts that had been eaten, and the butterflies that seemed to hover around everything. "Butterflies?" Feist said, and it was probably the only thing I'd heard him say in the hour that we'd been walking. "Yeah, Rico calls them something in Latin that basically means pale death. They show up around the bodies and just kind of mark where they are." Feist gave Martin a look, and the two nodded knowingly. "Have you seen anything near the sites? Footprints or scales, maybe. Stuff like insect skin?" I shook my head. "No, mostly just dead people." I was preparing to ask them what they thought they were looking for, since they clearly knew something, when we came through a dense stand of trees and into an open space that was anything but open. It seemed infested with the pale butterflies, and as we stalked in, they fluttered around us almost gladly. The two agents took this as a good sign, but weren't sure what to think. These things had been a pretty foul omen in the last few months, and finding a huge number of them now seemed less than ideal. As we moved into the cloud of butterflies, it also seemed like something was stalking us. Through the thick waves of insects, there was a large shadow that followed us. It almost appeared human-sized, but the longer I watched it flit through the swarm, it seemed to grow. It may have had as few as 2 arms, or as many as 8, but the wings I saw stir its smaller kin were what worried me. They were tall and white, just like the others, and it seemed to be using them as a blind to lure us in deeper. "It's close," Martin whispered. "Steady," Feist said. "If we spook him, he might fly away before we can take him out." "What?" I half whispered, talking too loud, but too scared to care. Feist looked at Martin, shrugging at something on the other's face. "You've heard of the Mothman. Well, there's a counterpart to that thing. The people of Joplin talk about how many of their children were saved from a tornado by these butterfly people, but they assume those who were lost were taken by that tornado, and not the same creatures who saved them. We call them Lycadia bipoptus, and they are extremely..." But he never got a chance to finish. Suddenly the cloud of butterflies enveloped us, their small bodies clinging to us as they struck. Our vision was cut off, and as the automatic weapons chattered, I hit my belly and started crawling. I wanted to get out of the swarm, to get away from the wild bark of the guns, and as I crawled, I heard somebody yelling. The wet sound of something being torn cut off some of the screaming, but the gunfire persisted as I kept making my way out of the cloud of insects. I kept crawling until I made it out of the clearing. Once I was no longer being buffeted by butterflies, I got up and started running. I could still hear the gunfire behind me, but I knew that what I wanted was to live. I knew that if I stayed, I'd be dead, and I still very much wanted to live. I ran until someone yelled at me to stop and shoved a gun in my face. It was another one of the agents, and as they all coalesced, I was ordered to take them back to the spot where I had left Agent Feist. As little as I wanted to go back, I agreed. By the time I got back, Feist was sitting on something he had covered with a tarp. Feist's left hand was hanging uselessly at his side. His clothes were ripped to shreds, but he was grinning like a big game hunter who'd bagged the big one. "Get it to the truck. Tell the boys back at base I had no choice but to kill it. It refused to come peacefully and forced my hand." Martin was dead, his body covered in a slew of crushed butterflies. I saw him before they could tarp him as well. Something had torn his throat out, and I assumed it was whatever was under the big tarp that Feist was guarding. They took both the tarped bodies away, and when Feist came towards me, I was worried he would be angry that I'd fled. He put a hand on my shoulder instead and nodded in understanding. "Don't feel bad, kid. I would have run too if I'd had the choice. Both Agent Martin and I knew what we were getting into. You got us here. That's what counts." They took it away, and the murders stopped. We lost 2 more hikers that year, but They were both killed by the elements. The butterflies left that same day, never, hopefully, to return. I can't help but think about that spring again, as winter abates and the seasons get warmer. I tell you one thing, I'll be keeping an eye peeled for butterflies from now on. You never know when they, and a new horror, might show up again. Hey guys, I heard so many of you liked my stories about the butterflies that you wanted to know a little more about the park. To answer your first question, no, the butterflies have not been back, but it's pretty early in the season, so I guess they have time. Today, however, I want to talk about something else that happened last year. It wasn't quite as odd as the butterflies, but it was still pretty weird. As a park ranger, I often get called upon to do search and rescue. I know what you're thinking, and the answer is no. I didn't find any stairs in the woods. I have yet to see a set, actually, and I hope to never encounter them. I did find something weird out there, though. Something I want to talk about, since you guys seem willing to listen. Fair warning, though, it's pretty strange, and I don't really have an explanation for it. So last summer, we got a call about a 9-year-old kid, Michael Peters, who'd gone missing from his campsite. That's not as uncommon as you might think. Little kids like to wander off on their own a lot, since they think they're immortal. It wouldn't be the first time we had to go look for some wannabe Bear Grylls who decided to go out and play in the woods, only to end up playing naked and afraid after a night of wandering in the woods. We were hoping we would find him alive, since it had only been about 24 hours since he'd gone missing. The parents were pretty upset, as parents are often wont to do, and the Forestry Service was calling for all hands on deck so that they could find this kid before something bad happened to him. So, we all put on our hiking boots, grabbed some provisions, and went out to have a look. If this all sounds a little cavalier, then I'm sorry. After a while, the attitude is how you distance yourself from the terrible things that sometimes happen here. Children go missing, people die of exposure, hikers are caught in landslides while hiking a trail that's rated for amateurs. If you stop to think about all of it, it really makes you wonder why you do it. We were pretty confident that we could find the kid. He hadn't been missing that long, and the chances were pretty good that he had just gotten lost in the woods and was waiting for someone to find him. We set out at first light, radios and gear strapped on just in case, and I was given the area around Carpenter's Woods. Carpenter's Woods gets its name from Alistair Carpenter, a man who lived on the property before it was a national park. Alistair Carpenter had come from New York, hoping to find a life that was a little simpler. He'd been an avid hiker for most of his life, and it's said that he had hiked all he meant to in the area surrounding his home. He wanted a challenge, wanted to go somewhere where his money wouldn't do him any good. So, he came out here to the middle of nowhere, built a cabin, and lived off the land. For the next 40 years of his life, this was where he lived. He fished in the streams, hunted the deer, generally kept his head down, and tried not to be noticed by the local Native American tribes, who still lived in the area. This was in the late 1800s, so the land still wasn't quite as settled as it would be. And when others found Carpenter out here thriving, they were impressed. When the park was first marked out in the 40s, the surveyors found his cabin and, incidentally, the remains of Alistair Carpenter. The cabin was still there and is now one of our biggest tourist draws. The remains were laid to rest at Katy Merrill Methodist Church, which is also on the grounds, and is another place that history buffs also come to see. I started my search at the cabin, not an uncommon place for people to go. It had been locked up since we didn't have a regular guide to come out here, and the inside was more than a little musty. The cabin was full of old furniture, the rustic kind that you make out of actual trees, as well as some shadow boxes of tools that Mr. Carpenter had used to survive. I didn't see any sign that anyone had come out here, inside or out, so I locked up the cabin and proceeded into the woods. The trails around the cabin are quite nice. They're also low-impact trails, so your grandmother could probably hike them without a lot of prep work. They're meant to be casually enjoyed, so it felt plausible that he would have gone down this way. The cabin was only a mile from the campsite where he'd gone missing, so I figured if we were going to find him anywhere, it'd probably be around here. It was hard not to equate him to the missing girl during the butterfly incident. I really hoped we wouldn't find him in a similar state, but it hadn't been the worst way that someone had died during that event, I suppose. The remains of the girl had been almost lovingly taken care of, and I suppose there were worse ways for a child to suffer in the forest. I was trying to remain positive, hoping for a happy ending on this one, but happy endings in the real world don't happen often enough. I'd been walking for about half an hour when I came across something in the tree line. It was a colorful chip bag, the smiling face of the orange goldfish looking back at me, and given its placement, I turned to look down one of the utility trails that led into the woods. These were not low-impact trails. They were cut to give access to pump sheds or sheds where we keep extra equipment, and they were often overgrown or less habitable than the communal trails for guests. If a kid had just rambled through the woods, I suppose it wouldn't be out of place for him to pick a trail at random and continue on his adventure. I got out the radio and called in what I had found, telling him I was heading towards the N-17 shed, and dispatch came back in the affirmative, telling me to be careful. So, I headed into the woods. I found the shed without too much trouble, and that was where I found my next clue. There was a water bottle sitting on the stoop of the shed. That wasn't terribly out of place either, since a lot of the rangers are kind of slobs. They preach about leaving no sign, but a lot of that comes down to do as I say and not as I do agenda. It would have been easy to just brush off, except when I looked at the bottle, it had 3 greasy-looking fingerprints emblazoned in orange dust on the outside. I had had enough siblings to know goldfish crumbs when I saw them, and it led me to believe that whoever had dropped the chip bag had probably had the water bottle too. Again, it didn't necessarily have to be the kid. As I looked around, I saw a side trail that led from the shed towards another utility trail. This one was overgrown, and I honestly couldn't picture a kid going down this way. I was ready to head back to the main trail when something caught my eye. A piece of fabric hanging from one of the overgrown branches. Just a little scrap of blue in that sea of green. Stood out like a sore thumb. I tried to remember what the parents had said the kid was wearing, and it seemed like blue shorts had been mentioned. I sighed. It would be the trail that led into Narnia, wouldn't it? Taking some gloves out of my bag, I started picking my way through the thick brush and overhanging thorns. It was slow going, as I had known it would be. But as I finally came through the tangles, I found a trail that was in slightly better shape than the ones leading away from the shed. The canopy overhead was dark, making me think of going through a tunnel, and the deeper I went, the stranger the sounds around me became. At one point, I could have sworn I heard a train whistle, but that shouldn't have been possible. The closest train would have been 30 miles to the west, nowhere near close enough to be heard, even on a clear day. I walked for about an hour and a half, and just as I was beginning to question how long the service trail was, I came upon the last thing I would have expected to find in a national park. It was a train station. I was completely still for a moment, just taking it all in as I tried to make sense of it. It was a perfectly normal-looking train station, sitting in the middle of the woods. Tracks were running off into the tree line in 2 directions, and both came up to a platform where you could buy tickets and little knickknacks or newspapers from the adjacent gift shop. It was all very clean, all very well maintained, and it was one of the strangest things I had ever seen in my entire life. I don't mean it was abnormal. I'd seen train stations before, just not out in the middle of the woods. It was jarring, like finding a perfectly preserved dining room table in the middle of an open field, or a cabin on a mountainside with the lights on and no one inside. It made me question my sanity as I approached it, but it was all very stable and very stationary. The ticket booth was empty, but I hadn't expected there would be anyone there. The Forestry Service barely had enough spare money to pay overtime, let alone to run a train station. The gift shop was equally empty, and most of the magazines were from the 90s. A Times magazine was talking about the Bill Clinton scandal. An Entertainment Today discussed a young up-and-comer named Britney Spears, and a tech magazine was talking about a revolutionary new computer that had 512 megabytes of memory. There were some snacks and some little toys as well, but all the snacks were expired, and I didn't feel like picking up a case of food poisoning to go along with all the weirdness. I wondered if the kid had found his way here too, and was rewarded by a little blue jacket sitting on one of the benches by the pickup area. It had one of those dogs from the Paw Patrol on it, the firefighter one, and it had also been in the reports with the blue shorts and the little green trainers that the kid had been wearing. He had been here for sure, and I wondered if maybe he had walked up the tracks, thinking it would take him back to civilization. I didn't know where those tracks went, but I was having a similar idea when I heard that lonesome train whistle come again. It was followed by an honest-to-God locomotive, and as I stood there stunned, the whole place shook as the train pulled out of the woods and came to rest by the loading area. It was a deep forest green, bearing the number 56 on the side of the loco, and it had 3 cars behind it which were fire engine red and looked freshly painted. The whole thing looked way too new to be crashing through the woods, and as the doors opened, I wondered if I ought to go in. I could only imagine that to some kid lost in the woods, the train would seem very cool. I stepped on board to see if he might still be there, hoping that we wouldn't go too far. I had never seen a second train stop in the woods, but I'd never seen a train in the woods until today either. The doors of the train shut as I stepped inside, and I braced myself as it lurched into motion. The inside of the train was nice, if not a little Spartan. The car I was in was nothing but rows of seats that were clean but not particularly interesting. I turned to the front of the car to see if I could have a look at the driver, but the door was locked and I couldn't see much of the engine. There was definitely a shadowy somebody behind the wheel, moving fitfully as he turned knobs and gears, but he ignored my pounding, and eventually I was forced to go explore the rest of the train. The second car appeared to be a dining car. The seats were replaced with tables and benches, and there was a long bar that was unmanned like everything else here. I called out to get someone's attention, but much like the driver, no one ever came to answer me. I didn't see the kid, so I decided to check the third car, and was finally rewarded with another person. Michael, the kid, was asleep on one of the train seats in the third car. He was curled up on one of the bench seats, pulling himself into a tight ball, and when I called his name, he woke up almost fearfully. I told him it was okay. I was a park ranger, and I was here to help him. He seemed overjoyed to see me, smiling as he wrapped me in a hug. I was exploring, and I found the old house that the carpenter man made. I wanted to go inside and look, but it was all locked up. So I went down the trail, and then I went down another trail, and that's when I found the train. I didn't know there was a train in the woods, so I got on, but it doesn't seem to stop. It just runs and runs, and I'm starting to get hungry. I ate some of the snacks from the little stand at the station, but the food car doesn't seem to have any food, and I'm really thirsty. I gave him some of my provisions out of my backpack and told him I'd sit with him until the train decided to stop. He seemed confused when I told him that the train had stopped to pick me up, but he figured it must have been while he was asleep. I asked him how long he had been on the train, but he said he didn't know. Felt like it might have only been hours, but sometimes he said it felt like it had been running longer than that. It doesn't always go through the woods either. I look out the window and sometimes there are mountains, sometimes there are deserts, and one time it even looked like we were underwater. The train just kind of goes, but I don't know where it's taking me. In hindsight, the kid wasn't wrong. Felt like we rode that train for days, the scenery shift being the only way to tell the actual track of time. Eventually, the food in my pack ran out. It hadn't been much to start with, a couple of water bottles and an MRE, along with a few granola bars. As we watched the woods turn into the prairies for the third time, I started to wonder if I'd ever get off this train. At some point, I must have dozed off because I came to and found that the train had stopped. We were back in the woods, the doors were open, and before I could think too hard about it, I picked up the kid and ran for the doors. He had been asleep as well, and he jerked awake as I grabbed him up. He quieted down when he saw it was me, but he seemed confused when we came out onto the pickup area. Are we back? Did the train finally let us go? I told him it seemed to have, and as the train closed its doors and rolled off again, we made our way back to the real world. Michael was reunited with his family an hour later. A search party found us as we came out by Carpenter's cabin, but they were no longer just looking for Michael. This search party was looking for me. According to the Park Service, I'd been missing for the last 12 hours. They'd been calling me for most of that time without answer, and dispatch had redirected one of the teams after they hadn't found the kid either. I told them the battery on my walkie must have gone dead, and I think they were mostly just glad that I'd found the kid. Michael tried to tell them about the train, but nobody seemed to believe him. I shrugged when they asked me about it, and the kid looked hurt until I gave him a little wink. I don't think anybody would believe us about a train in the middle of the woods, but I probably should have prepared him for that. I've been back on that trail since, but it's just a trail now. It doesn't go anywhere except the outflow utility road, and it seems the forest train only appears when it wants to be found. There are a lot of strange things in the woods, some of which I'm beginning to see. I'll keep you guys updated if I see anything else. If the Forestry Service doesn't shut me down first, that is. Till then, stay safe when you're out in the woods. Don't go taking rides from weird trains you find out in the woods while hiking unfamiliar paths. You never know where they might let you out at. I was talking with a ranger on shift the other day, and he had a strange story from a couple of years ago. The ranger, we'll call him Jacob, had been doing this for about 15 years, and he's seen more in that time here than I could ever hope to. Missing kids, murdered campers, lost people who just wander up out of the depths after being gone for decades, lost hikers who aren't as lost as we might think. We were talking about weird stuff in the park. I had told him about the train that I had encountered while looking for the kid, and he asked me if I'd seen any weird critters in the woods. I told him I had, filling him in on the thing about the butterflies and the other thing, before asking what sort of things he had seen. He got quiet for a minute as he thought about the best way to tell it. I almost thought he wasn't going to, but he seemed to decide on it after some quiet and leaned in close like he was afraid that someone would hear him. You know how far our property goes, right? Like damn near to the outskirts of Atlanta, and then up to North Carolina. The park looks like a long, jagged scar on the map, and the park's size is really kind of daunting. There are some 30 rangers to cover the whole park, which is why we end up calling in volunteers for large-scale searches. The saving grace is that a lot of it is dense woodland tracks, animal sanctuaries, spots too difficult to get to for your average hiker. The park that the guests see is a squirt in the bucket, and we have a hard time maintaining that. I nodded, not sure where he was going with this, but curious nonetheless. So one afternoon, as I was manning the phones at the station, I get a call about a vehicle that's parked along an access road near the northern edge. The second they told me the location, I knew this was going to be some weirdness. I tried to call a couple of rangers that were also on duty in the park, but none of them had their ears on, it seemed. In the end, I decided to go myself, and I found myself dreading the trip. I asked him why, and he looked at me like I was slow. It was the LK-76 access road. When I didn't immediately look startled, he rolled his eyes at me. God, you must be new. The LK-76 road is that road they had all the missing hikers on about 10 years ago. There was a gathering in the woods near the access road. A bunch of hippie types with tents and stuff. And the Forestry Service was out there for days trying to track them all down. It was one of the biggest incidents I was ever a part of, and some of those people are still missing to this day. There's about 10 names still on that list as unfound, and I doubt we'll ever locate them. You know as well as I do that sometimes people go into those woods and just don't come back out. And this was a larger event than most in that respect. I tried to remember if I'd heard anything about that, and I decided it probably wasn't the kind of thing they put in the orientation packet. So there I am, driving an hour out to the spot in question, and I get there just as dusk is setting in. There's a minivan parked by the side of the dirt road, just like the report had said, and as I'm looking at the tag and calling it in, I see something glint off the metal and turn to see a fire in the woods. Not like a forest fire, but like a campfire off the road a ways. Looks to be less than a mile in, and if night hadn't been falling pretty damn quick, I would have probably never seen it. I decided to go check it out, thinking it was probably just the owner of the van, and come up on a familiar clearing that I haven't thought about in years. The last time I'd seen it, the place was full of tents and trash, people sitting around asking questions from park staff. Tonight, though, there was only a single fire burning in the pit. A young woman was sitting beside it, maybe 30 at the most, with a sleeping kid in her lap. The kid was school-aged, probably about 9, and she looked at me expectantly as I stepped close to her fire. Her expectation turned to surprise, however, and it appeared I wasn't who she was looking for. "Oh, sorry, I was expecting someone else," she said. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," I said, taking a seat by the fire. "We had reports of a vehicle on the access road, and when I saw your fire, I thought it might belong to you." She nodded at me. "It is. My son and I are just waiting for his father to join us. No need to worry about us." Looking around, I decided there might be several reasons to worry about them. It was August at the time, and she was in a simple dress and no shoes. The kid was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, though at least he had shoes on. There wasn't a sleeping bag or a tent in sight, and though the season was mild, it could still get down in the low 40s at night. I didn't see any coolers for food or water either, and unless the fella she was waiting on was bringing a whole bunch of supplies, they were likely in for a bad time. She smiled when I told her that, stroking the kid's hair as he slept soundly against her. "Not quite as prepared as I was the first time I camped here, but once his father arrives, I doubt we'll need much of anything." "Have you camped out here before?" I asked, the campfire casting her face in a ghostly refrain. "Once, when I was very young. My family came out here to commune with nature and got a little more than they bargained for." I sat for a moment, listening to the fire crackle, mulling over what she had said and guessing at the meaning. "You don't mean you were here with those people?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes turning a little hot. "Those people were my family. At least they were back then," she added, the last like an afterthought, and it cooled some of the heat in those eyes. As I listened, I realized I had heard what he was talking about before. How could I have forgotten? It had been all over the news when I was in middle school, and it had been all anyone could talk about for weeks. It had excited a lot of people in the worst way possible in my semi-religious community. The news reports had called the group Satanists, but Mom and Dad had told us they were probably just people out doing crazy things in the woods. Ties to Satan or not, a bunch of them had gone missing, and the ones that had come out of the woods hadn't been right. They claimed they had seen things they couldn't quite explain, and for 2 weeks there had been general panic around whatever they had seen and whatever they had been doing out in the woods. I wanted to ask her to tell me what had happened, but it seemed rude at the time. How do you just ask someone to explain to you about what was probably one of the worst days of their life? Turned out I didn't have to ask. As we sat there listening to the fire, she just began talking, uninvited. He had taken me out of my thoughts when he started talking, and I focused my attention back on him. Our leader had brought us out to the woods to be with nature, but he actually meant to commune with something else. We didn't know that he had been researching local legends and had decided that whatever was in the woods was worth seeking. He wanted us to be safe, though. He wasn't a complete fool, so he enlisted the help of a local guide. The kid, at the time he was only a little older than I was, came well vetted, but turned out to be a little green. He set up what he believed was a proper protective circle, burnt the right things to keep whatever might come at bay, but it was all for nothing. She then looked down at the kid sleeping on her lap as she stroked his hair. I can't lay it all at his feet, I suppose. We did our part as well. Amadeus had whipped them into a frenzy with a mixture of drugs and alcohol, and when we got what we wanted, we decided to get nosy. We went to investigate, despite the advice of the guide, and ended up unmaking all of his preparations. With the protection unmade, he decided to wash his hands of us, and went to go protect himself instead. I went to try and help my friends and family, but that's when I met this one's father. She stopped long enough for me to think she wouldn't go on, and when she started again, it was a little surprising. I remember jumping as if struck, her voice older than her 30 years, and wondered if I wanted to know the end. He met several members of my family that night, but to 3 of us, he left little gifts. Gifts like this one, she said, as she looked down at the sleeping boy. Gifts that killed the other 2, but not me for some reason. Is that why you're out here? I asked. She nodded. He's been calling to the boy, telling him things that he can't understand, telling him things that he doesn't want to understand. It was inevitable that he would call him back, so now we've come to see it through. We were quiet for a little while, but all at once it began to sound like something was moving in the woods. It was big, whatever it was, and I began to hear noises that didn't make a lot of sense. The grunts of deer, the soft chuffing of bears, the clittering sound of raccoons, the chirping of squirrels, and all of it seemed to swirl around us like an angry wind. I whipped my head about as if I might keep it at bay with the knowledge that I could see it, but the woman had no such idea. She just sat and stroked her child, looking as if this was what she had expected to find. It appears that he has found us. I would suggest you leave, if you ever intend to leave again. If my van is still there tomorrow, go ahead and have it towed. I don't think I'll be needing it. Not where I'm going. I didn't need any more prompting than that. I ran out of that clearing, heading in the direction I believed the road to be. Behind me, the fire went out, and I heard those noises converge on that clearing, like waves rolling up to the shore. Fortunately for me, I had been correct. I came out on the road about 30 minutes later, and after getting in my truck, I drove like the devil himself was behind me. I got a call 3 days later to let me know the van was still out there, and I told them to call the wrecker and have it towed back to the city. Whoever she wasn't going to need it anymore. The 2 of us sat there as his story came to a close, and I suddenly felt as if my forest train was nothing more special than a tree full of newborn squirrels. It's best to remember, strange things happen in these woods. You could try to rack your brain over it, like I did with the woman and her campfire, but it'll never lead you to anything. It's best to just put it out of your mind, go about your business. Otherwise, you might become whatever it is business in the end." He left then, getting in his car and driving home, and after locking up the ranger station for the night, I did the same. I've got more stories from my first year as a park ranger, and maybe I'll tell you if the park service doesn't shut me down. Till then, take care of yourselves while you're out in the woods. Treat them with respect, because they will not hold the same respect for you. Hey guys, it's your favorite park ranger again. Some of you have asked how I got started being a park ranger. It's actually a pretty interesting story, one that really started my journey with the Park Service and sets the tone for the rest of my career. So after graduating high school, I started trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I thought about college, but ultimately dismissed the idea. I was a solid B student, and the thought of going back to school seemed terrible. I'd been volunteering as an assistant scoutmaster, working part-time at the community pool, and started thinking it might be nice to be doing something in the woods. I'd never considered the park services, but when I found a flyer on a bulletin board while I was taking some of the kiddos on a hike, I thought I might have found something to try out. Wanted, fire watch tower operator, high school diploma, reference is a must, outdoor skills a plus, ability to stay in the woods for 90 days, an absolute must. $4,800 at the end of 90 days with the potential to re-enroll with good service. Contact Ranger Station A for inquiries. I did a little more than call the station. Once I had concluded the hike and the kids were back in their minivans and compact cars with their parents, I went to Station A to inquire in person. There were a couple of bored-looking rangers sitting around, but after some questions and some finger-pointing, I was directed to Ranger Thurman, someone who would eventually be my boss. He shook my hand, taking in my scoutmaster garb, and asked about my credentials. I explained that I was an assistant scoutmaster, a lifeguard, an avid hiker, and an amateur rock climber, and that I was looking for something to give me a chance to think about my next step in life. Thurman had laughed. "Well, 3 months is a long time to think, kiddo. You sure you're up for it? It drives some of them stir-crazy. They end up naked in the woods by the time we find them." I told him I thought I could handle it, and he took my application and said he'd get back to me. A week later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, and it turned out to be him. "So it's been a slow season for sign-ups, but not a slow season for fires. The head ranger has actually opened up 3 decommissioned towers this season, so the need for help is at an all-time high. If you think you can handle yourself, I'm willing to give you a shot." Told him I'd be happy for the opportunity, and he told me to come to the station on Monday for orientation. Orientation was lengthy, but mostly shook out to staying alert, not getting distracted, and spending most of your time in the tower. You would be keeping watch in one of the 7 fire towers, the big metal structures that sat about 80 feet off the ground. Once a week, there would be a delivery of provisions. Nothing fancy, but very sustainable. The tower had power, thanks to a generator near the base, and gas for the week would be part of that weekly delivery. Other than that, we were free to do whatever we liked, as long as we were keeping watch. Speaking of keeping watch, I had my eye on a blonde in the 3rd row for most of the presentation. She looked like someone who laid out a lot, her skin tanned and her hair pulled back into a tail. I wondered what tower she was going to be in, and whether I might strike up a friendship with her while we were assigned here. Don't hold it against me. I was young, and most of my brain was earmarked for one thing and one thing only. I wanted to speak with her after the orientation had ended, but she rushed off and I never got the chance. I figured I'd get another chance when they sent us our assigned towers, but no such luck. A week later, I got orders to report to the Fringe Trail, Route A, and Thurman was waiting for me with a pack of gear and some final instructions. "There's a radio in there. Keep it going. If you run into any trouble, call the station immediately. We don't usually hire kids who aren't past 25, but we're short, and I'll be honest, I got a good feeling about you. If you make it through the 90 days, I might have something more permanent, if you're interested. You've got the skill set I usually look for when hiring rangers for my team." I told him I'd think about it, but right then I was only interested in getting to the tower and getting set up. "Tower's at the end of the trail. You can't miss it. It's about 2 miles in, so I hope you packed light." I had, and I came to the tower at about 3 o'clock after a pretty easy hike through the park. I'd seen the fire towers from a distance, and I knew that most of them were on the edges of the park, so they could see the more remote areas on the fringes of the recreation area. The fire watch was less for camping areas or swimming holes, and more for the scrublands and the untraveled areas. We were watching for lightning strikes, stray cigarettes from inexperienced hikers, and people who think they're ready for more rigorous camping, but are less prepared than they think. I found the tower easily enough, and to my surprise, it had a ramp leading up to it, as opposed to a ladder. After 2.5 hours on the trail, it was a nice surprise. The observation deck wasn't anything fancy, but I hadn't expected it to be. A single bed, a kitchenette, some paperback books on a shelf, a lot of glass that overlooked the woods. There looked to be a river nearby, a little gorge off to the left, a lot of green trees waving hello. All in all, wasn't a bad view for a few months, and I was looking forward to seeing what lay within the depths of those woods. It was getting dark, so I settled in, watching the sun sink below the horizon, when the radio crackled and I heard Ranger Thurman call for a check-in. "Tower 3, checking in," I said when my turn came, and as I set the radio down, I tuned out the rest of them. 1 day down, 89 to go, I thought. I turned the switch on for the lights and went to check out the paperbacks on the shelf as I looked for something to do. I had my phone, but the reception here was spotty at best. There was no Wi-Fi out here, not like I'd expected there to be, and as I found a Dean Koontz novel I hadn't read before, I heard the radio crackle as someone called someone else by name, clearly looking for some company. I tuned it out and kept reading, but after a while, I heard other people inviting people to go to different channels on the radio. It appeared that a few of them were attempting to start a party line, which was just as well because the book I'd picked was kind of dull. I twisted through the channels, listening to the chatter from the other 7 towers, but I didn't really feel moved to chime in on any of the conversation. They were talking about sports or video games or movies, and most of them weren't talking about anything I really had an interest in. I twisted off Channel 4 when I heard the subject matter, and I couldn't believe that 2 of them were doing that right out in the open on an open channel. They had known each other for a couple of hours, tops. Get a room, for God's sakes. That's how I landed on Channel 7 and heard an unsure voice that would be my company for the next few months. "Hello? Anyone there?" "Tower 3's here. Who's this?" "Gretchen, from Tower 13. I'm glad somebody found me here. I felt like I was getting lost in the chatter of the other towers." Tower 13 wasn't one I was familiar with. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was someone playing a game, and I was hopeful that it was the cute girl from orientation. I didn't know what tower she had been sent to, but I was confident that she had a radio too. "Well, Gretchen from Tower 13, how did you find the conversation on the other channels?" "Pretty dull, honestly. They chattered about sports or movies or whatever. It's the same every year, to be fair. They just talk about boring things and spend the next 3 months ignoring all the natural beauty around them." I leaned back in my bunk, deciding I liked her even more. "And how do you like the beauty of nature?" "I like it a lot. There's a warren of rabbits within easy view of my tower, and I love watching them come out when they feel safe. They nibble and hop around. It's pretty adorable. There's a nest not too far from the warren of some hawks that seem to come back every year to nest. I know the one this year is the same because he's got the same tail stripe like the little one from last year. I'd have to break out my binoculars and have a look around when the sun came up. I would love to spend my days watching the deer or the birds who made the area their home. Gretchen was starting to sound more and more like my kind of girl, and as we talked about nature and hiking and whatnot, I watched the night slip by until I realized it was almost 2 a.m. "Hey, I better get some sleep," I told her. "Don't want to sleep through any potential fires tomorrow." "Oh, I didn't realize it was so late. Well, when you want to talk, hop on Channel 7. Someone seems to have left a radio here, so I find myself with two. I'll keep one on the main channel and one on 7, just for you." I smiled, wishing her good night, and swapped back to channel 1. It seemed I had made a friend, and it was a friend who would fill my evenings with conversation for the next few months. The next couple of weeks seemed to fly by. I spent my days hiking to various things, checking on hikers that Dispatch had sent me out after, going to reported fires in the area. It was a dry summer, so fires in the park were strictly prohibited, and even once to check on a drunk that someone had reported wandering near my tower. Mostly, however, I sat in my tower and watched for fires. It was a big year for fires too, but not that early in the season. This was June, and we all knew that the need to watch wouldn't really be dire until July. That was when attendance would be at its highest, and we'd need to keep our eyes peeled for smoke day and night. "Those are always the worst weeks," Gretchen confided. "I've seen more fire and rescue come in July than any other month. Last year, a family accidentally set their tent on fire by not putting out their campfire and burned up a big section of the woods in the process. They all died, which was sad, but they should have been more careful." We talked a lot more about fires that night, and I remember it being the end of June because I thought it was our 3-week anniversary. Silly, I know, since we weren't even dating, but I felt like she wouldn't have minded. I hadn't really done much besides a little bit of chatter with the other towers, and it was rare for me to swap my radio over to channel 1 again before about 2 a.m. after final check-in. I spent most of my evenings with Gretchen, and I felt like she was as glad for the company as I was. "Hey, what do you do when you aren't in a fire tower?" I asked on a whim. There was silence for a moment before Gretchen finally got back to me. "I don't know, not much I suppose. Usually just come back for another season." "Well, would you want to do something after the season is over?" I asked, holding my breath as I waited for her response. You're sweet, but I just don't think we'd work out like that." I felt a little disappointed, but I understood. "I get it. You're probably married or something out in the real world. I get it." "Oh, no, it's nothing like that. It's just, this is kind of my life. I come back season after season because I love this place. The tower is more of a home to me than the one I came from, and I can't imagine anywhere but here." "That's fair, but maybe we could at least go get a coffee or something and see how things go." She laughed. "I'd like that." It was the second week of July when the big fire happened that would lead me to meet Gretchen and understand why things wouldn't work between us. The official report said that it was started by an improperly extinguished campfire. Some coals had been burning under the dirt the campers had thrown on it, and it had caught and spread to a nearby field of very dry, tall grass. The woods went up quickly, the rain having been sparse since May. The fire was in a part of the park that wasn't really attended, mostly scrublands and little valleys, so that was good for evacuation. The bad news was that it was about 3 miles from my tower, and I was asleep when it got big enough for another tower to see and report it. By the time they reported it, however, I was out of the tower and running for my life. I had signed off at about 1:30, telling Gretchen I'd talk to her tomorrow, and when her less than melodic voice broke into my dreams about an hour later, I came up groggily from sleep. I was convinced I was still dreaming. I could smell smoke, I could hear the sounds of frantic animals as they fled, and I picked up my radio to see how she had gotten in touch with me and what the problem was. I stood up, asking her what was wrong, when I saw the fire coming closer and closer to my tower. I started to turn back to channel 1, apparently having passed out with the radio on channel 7, but Gretchen came back on to tell me that it was already reported. "If you don't leave right now, you won't get a chance. The fire is spreading quicker than normal, and it's going to cut you off if you aren't careful. Get your boots on and go." I threw my boots on, grabbed my hiking pack, and barely remembered to grab the radio before I ran out into the night. I swapped to 1 and tried to call it in, but the fire must have knocked something out because none of the channels gave me anything but harsh static. I turned back to 7 and started heading away from the fire, making my way up a stream pretty close to the tower. If I could get into the stream, I might be safe, but if it boxed me in, then it could also be stuck there, with nowhere to go. "Cut north," the radio said, and I almost dropped it. I'd forgotten I'd brought it with me, and as I fumbled my compass out and gained my bearings, I headed north. I couldn't understand why fire and rescue wasn't already on the scene. The fire was big enough to be seen by more than just my tower, but I put it out of my mind as I headed towards the river. "A little more east," Gretchen said. "Not too much. There you go. Keep heading that way and you'll miss the fire." I could see it coming up my right side, the heat baking off it enough to make me squint. I hadn't realized that it was that dry out here, but I was quickly being hemmed in by the fire. I needed a way out, but I didn't know if I could make it before I was trapped. "Go east through the creek and look for the tower. Once you make it there, you should be safe." "Which tower?" I asked, coughing as the smoke hit my throat. "It's mine. It's 13. Just make it here. It should be outside the fire line." I kept running, coughing as I tried to get away from the spreading heat. Gretchen helped me, telling me which way to go. When I stumbled into the dry creek, she told me to get up and run, or I'd get stuck in there. The flames were coming on strong, eating up the dry ground like a hungry beast, and I scrambled out of the dry bed and saw the top of a tower against the purple sky. It was dark, but maybe that made it easier for her to see me. It wasn't until I came to the base of the tower that I had my doubts. The tower was old, rickety even, and looked like this wasn't the first fire it had seen. It sat in a clump of new trees, the ground around it scraggy and disturbed, and I couldn't see a thing up top. On the side, the numbers nearly unintelligible, was a faded 13. "Are you in there?" I asked, hesitating before just climbing this death trap to see someone I was beginning to doubt was there. "Yeah, come on up." Something moved then. Something slithered behind the windows, and suddenly I thought I might have been safer with the fire. It was nothing substantial, just a quick trailing of mist, but it was something, and it filled me with an insatiable dread. I should not be here, my mind yelled. I should be somewhere else, somewhere safe, somewhere with people. And as I took a step away, I heard Gretchen again come from the radio. "What's wrong? Getting cold feet?" I didn't answer. I took a step away, but as I did, something stepped out onto the observation deck of the tower. It was too dark to see, its body made of midnight, but I could see eyes looking down at me, and they looked anything but friendly. "Come up," called Gretchen, her voice coming from the whatever it was, like a recording. "Come up. I can't wait to see you." Just then, a spotlight hit me, and the thing screeched like it had been shot. "Don't move," said a loudspeaker from the helicopter overhead. "We'll drop a ladder for you." I took one more look at the tower, but whatever it had been wasn't there anymore. They helped me into the helicopter, and it wasn't until we took off that my heart rate hit something like normal. All in all, the fire burned about 80 acres, but fire and rescue got water on it quickly enough and stopped it from spreading. There were no fatalities, though the tower I was in did need to be completely rebuilt. If I had been in there 10 minutes longer, they would have been cleaning up my remains with a shovel. At least that's what the park rangers said. I got pulled into the head ranger's office after the EMTs checked me out, and we had a long talk about how I had managed to get out of my tower in time, make it past the fire line, and still not call it in. I told him how the radio hadn't been functioning properly, and I'd simply run for my life. He commended me for my quick thinking when it came to getting out of danger, and seemed impressed with my performance through the Firewatch program. "Given that your tower was destroyed, we can't exactly send you back. We'll have to have the closest 2 towers keep an eye on your area, but I do have something if you're interested in a job." He had an open junior ranger position. It was part-time, minimum wage, and probably would come with a lot of overtime, but he promised me if I toughed it out for a year and passed all the training courses involved, he would promote me to full ranger after that year. Despite almost being burned to death and caught by a something or another, I still liked the woods and wanted to work there. I agreed, and he was as good as his word. A year later, I was a full park ranger, and a few weeks into my stint as junior ranger, the orders came for us to tear down the old Firewatch towers. I knocked Tower 13 down myself, and it felt pretty good. So that's my story. Maybe it isn't as weird as I thought it was, but it was pretty weird for me. If you want more, let me know. I'm sure I have some more weird tales from my past in one of Georgia's largest state parks.